agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, my conservative and libertarian counterparts, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson, as well as Oklahoma Christian University political scientist, Trey Orndorff. Hey, guys.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
So how are you? How are you doing, Trey? I'll start with you, Trey. How are you doing this week?
Listen, this is the time of year when all the students are graduating, and so I am just happy that I survived this week.
Yeah, I hear you. We're a little later in the schedule than you are, so I'm kind of going through this in the following week. But it's a rough time. How about you, Jay?
Happier than Madison Cawthorn with a Victoria's Secret gift card, Mike.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that. Oh, yeah, a fun party guy. There we go. Oh, right. Well, before we get going today, I wanted to acknowledge that I was wrong and Jay was right about something. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's unique enough that I want to point it out, But listeners will recall that a while ago, actually in October of 2021, we made some inflation predictions. And I said by mid-April 2022, I bet that inflation would be under 4%. And Jay said, nope, going to be higher. And Jay was absolutely right about that. And I could say, I didn't account for X, Y, and Z, but it really doesn't matter because the prediction was the prediction. Jay was right about that. I was wrong about that. And it looks like Jay will also be right about the mid-July 2022 predictions, where I said at that point under 3%. Jay said, nope, going to be higher. And I would be stunned if I didn't turn out to be wrong about that, which clearly I did not factor in Omicron or some other things as well. China's zero COVID policy and all kinds of other things, and certainly not a war in Ukraine. But there you go. The world's a crazy place. And Jay made more allowance for that than I did. And he was right on both of those predictions. So kudos to you, Jay, for being
Thank
right.
you.
Now, of course, I'll point out that Jay's still wrong about the China giving material aid to Russia. I think we all hope that Jay stays wrong on that one, certainly. But we will see. All right. So today we're going to be talking about a bunch of things that we're going to do a round two: DeSantis versus Disney, Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and what that might mean, more on Russia and Ukraine, Title 42 and the border, the Supreme Court are hearing a big religious expression case, and if we have time for it, our uniquely stupid last decade, or has it been? Anyway, we will get to all of that in just 1 minute. Okay, so last week on the show, Jay and I discussed Florida's move to revoke Disney's special authority in areas it owns and operates in the state after the company came out against what's been commonly referred to as the Don't Say Gay law, though the formal title is the Parental Rights in Education law. Now, our discussion generated a lot of listener questions and comments, and in reviewing them and thinking about that conversation, I thought it would be good if we were maybe clearer on both the law itself and our views of Disney's and the state of Florida's reaction. And Trey also took part in these exchanges on our Discord channel, which is why I asked him to join us today, for a number of reasons, because I thought he offered some unique and valuable perspectives, as well as sort of illustrating what I see as an important distinction between libertarian thought and conservative thought. And so we'll certainly get into that. But I felt like the best place to start here would be with the legislation itself, which Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law at the end of March last month. And the measure of the law that's been really the focus of all the controversy, because it's part of a larger parental rights thing, but the part that we've been focused on is as follows: classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3 or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. Now, what that means at a bare minimum, is that teachers or other school officials can't talk about those topics in the classroom with kids from kindergarten through grade 3. And last week, Jay argued that that seemed reasonable to him, and actually I'm inclined to agree about that. But the first point I think we can discuss here is that the language actually of the legislation expands on that. It's not just that, because that last part about age appropriateness and state standards gives the state's Department of Education the authority to determine, well, what's appropriate instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity for all students in Florida's public K through 12 schools. And that's going to be uniform across the state, meaning that local school districts and school boards will be forced to adhere to those state mandates for everything relating to gender and sexual orientation. And the Florida Department of Education has until June 30th of 2023 to write those specific appropriateness regulations. So let's start with that. And I guess I'll start with you on this, Trey. Are you at all bothered by what seems to me to be a broad grant of regulatory authority to a state agency? And as you know, Florida is a very diverse state, and that imposes yet to be determined universal mandate on all the local school districts.
You know, you had introduced the conversation talking about what we had been talking about on Slack for those of us who have the executive support producer level, and then for what our conversations on Discord was. And I guess the answer, the short answer is, yeah, it's problematic. And, for example, you were ceding to Jay a little bit about suggesting here that you were okay with the K through 3 ban potentially, depending on how it came down the pike. And so just to give an example here, I think we would have some space between us, because that's something that I would want to have part of my children's curriculum, although I wouldn't want to push it on somebody else. And I think that kind of sums up part of the problem that we're seeing here with both of these, both the bill and then the fallout from the bill.
Okay. Jay?
Look, to me, again, I'm glad we're going back to the bill as it's written, because there are a couple things that are pretty clear. One, it's classroom instruction, and it specifies those grade levels. And I would say, look, as much as I'm not crazy about throwing out authority to outside regulatory agencies, setting state standards in education and curriculum, that's kind of what state boards of education do, right? And I've often argued that they probably do too much of it, and I'd stand by that. But I don't see this as, listen, if you're going to determine what's the appropriate standard, that would be the place to do it. That's the place where it's typically done. I'd assume that their State Department or State Board of Education does the same thing with its reading curriculum, its math curriculum, with all these other things that determines what's appropriate for what grade, and what are the basic standards that ought to be applied, what benchmarks the kids, should kids be meeting by certain grades and so forth. So to me, that doesn't strike me as an overbroad grant of power to administrative agencies, and I'm someone who's sensitive to that. That's not to say that it's not possible that power could be abused, right? But that there would be remedies for that, and I think as it's written, I don't see it as a facial problem, if you will.
It seems to me that one could make a distinction, and I understand what you're saying, and certainly I agree. There are state standards for all sorts of different topics, whether it's history, English, what have you. But I'm wondering if there's an important distinction, a meaningful distinction to be drawn between standards concerning the minimum of what schools in the state must instruct students in, and bans on things that local school districts cannot instruct students in. It feels to me like, yes, they're both state standards, but it feels to me like there's an important difference there. What do you think, Trey?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is, and that's why it gets branded the Don't Say Gay bill, is so no one, you're not going to encounter anyone who is a negative number in the universe, right? So if we have standards about math, that's a fundamentally different category than talking about standards of what human behavior is and like the people that might be in your actual classroom. So again, to kind of pull back just from the question of the, should a state regulatory body be the one to make these determinations about education? I think I'll probably disagree with both of you, but let's just put it back. I would make a distinction here that in this particular instance, what we're saying is that there are certain kinds of people, including K through 3 people, because they are people, who, if we take the science seriously, means that they cannot have a conversation about what they in fact are.
Well, again, Trey, I'd jump in and say this isn't about having conversations. This is about classroom instruction.
Well, and I think that's a good point. But then I think that raises the question to me. Well, what does that mean? Now, that certainly means at a minimum formal lessons, right? But does classroom instruction, and I can see classroom instruction construed to meaning, well, any sort of statement made by the teacher, in front of the entire class. Like referring to a same-sex partner, answering a question from a kid who wants to be referred to as they as opposed to he or she or something like that. And certainly, even if that's a judgment call sort of thing, the way that the legislation is structured is it gives these parents, a course of action, there's this magistrate that has to be hired at the expense of the school district to adjudicate these things. And so, it seems to me that this legislation was designed to be intentionally vague so that it would have a chilling effect on a certain type of speech. And to me, that's fundamentally problematic and very different from state standards saying that, well, students will be exposed to, will learn at least this. This is a state standard saying, well, students will not be allowed to be exposed to this. And that to me is troublesome. What do you go ahead.
I'm jumping in here. I would go back to the state standards, though. What the state standards are supposed to deal with is what is age appropriate for each grade level.
Right.
Right. So it's not a forbidding. Now, I think if there was some state standard and they said, listen, it is inappropriate to say the word gay or to refer to someone's sexuality or anything like that at the high school level. Well, that I think would be ludicrous, right? And I think people ought to, say that that's ludicrous. If you can't say, hey, you know what, in your high school English class, Oscar Wilde was pretty gay, that I think that's a big issue, because I think that is perfectly appropriate discussion in at that level. But getting into that stuff at K through 3 is not. And I'd point out other things in terms of appropriateness of topic presentation. I would gather that everyone would agree that teaching about the Holocaust is absolutely appropriate and necessary. How you do that, though, I think there's different sort of age appropriateness ways to talk about that, right? I think if you present, for example, a lot of the facts of the Holocaust as they are to kindergartners, that's horrific. If you have that same discussion and read the Diary of Anne Frank in the 7th, 8th, 9th grade, something like that, that's something else. So I think it's not a matter of saying you can't address these topics. It's that these topics ought to be addressed in a manner that's appropriate to the grade in which it's being which they're being introduced.
And so,
and again, I think there's nothing particularly different about that.
Go ahead, Trey.
Same thing with history, right? I'm sure there is, one version of our history stories that we tell when we're teaching about them in the very, very young levels, right? Pilgrims got on the boat, came over. When you get into, later grades and you can get into more complexity, more adult, themes, if you will, then I think that's appropriate to teach that then. So.
Well, I want to get into that because I think you make an excellent point, Jay, but I want to kind of throw it back in a way and see a response, because I think part of what you're suggesting here, and this is one of the other things we were talking about online, was, so I like that you went to the idea of, say, like the Holocaust or the history, because what you're effectively saying is that there are difficult moral issues that
Right.
need to be handled
Or slavery would be another one.
carefully.
Yeah.
Yeah, with children. The I think the problem here really hinges then on our expectations of sexual morality as it pertains to the LGBTQ community. Because I think what I would suggest to you is that where you make that connection to say that the LGBTQ community falls into a similar category of we have to be careful because it's a potentially fraught issue. I think for somebody from the LGBTQ community, what they're going to be saying is, well, no, that's as simple as like, hey, I exist and here I am. And so that's, I think, part of the problem here is the question that this all hinges on the underlying ethical principle of whether or not these behaviors are divergent morally or not. If they are, then I think that your argument holds a lot of water. If they aren't, then I think it loses some of its steam.
Mike, you can jump in. I have a response.
No, I mean, I certainly would agree with that in general. So since Trey stated that argument, if you have a kind of response to that, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think let's put it this way. I think that the idea of the lesson about where babies come from, right? Heterosexual sexuality, that's certainly not divergent from norms, I would say. But you certainly don't want to be teaching sex to that that sort of lesson in the K through 3 level. That hey, this is how it works. Mom does this, and dad does this, and my God, no. It's just sort of this goes back to maybe sort of a just base conservative thing about look, we don't teach our kids about young kids about sexuality or present it in any sort of graphic way. It's again, the appropriate lesson would be, to the extent that there needs to be a lesson in this, as well. When daddy loves mommy very much, and they have a baby, that kind of thing, right? But it's completely different, and that. So what I'm saying is, there are plenty of sexual behaviors that would not be divergent, that are pretty much the norm, but still they shouldn't be taught at that level.
Well, then,
and again, I'd say it certainly is it appropriate later. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if this is putting it in the libertarianist terms. Is this a big government solution in search of a problem? Because Florida law already bans sex education until 5th grade, a lot of the stuff you're talking about there. So, I mean, certainly a lot of folks on the left, and I'm one of them, would argue that this is just basically a ginned-up issue, a fake moral panic that's been aroused on the right, and particularly by Ron DeSantis, who wants to get that sort of conservative vote as he eyes the presidency. And it's essentially something that is not an issue that they made into an issue to generate some anger and fear and political capital. And gosh, that's sure how it seems to me. What do you think, Trey?
Well, I think part of it, I think you're right, but I think the bit of it here is that there's a big, I think we should just be open about it. There's a big portion of the United States population that sees these things as being bad and threatening. And so whether or not this particular bill is useful doesn't matter, because it taps in. It's a position take by DeSantis in an ultimate president's run that taps into a moral fear about the LGBTQ community. This is something, it's not something I can go into a lot of detail here, but it's something that has even played out here on my campus. And so, and to your earlier point about is this the, government looking for a problem? I think the answer is, well, yeah. I mean, one of the, I think Jay and I are having we probably have a difference of opinion on what we would want our children to be having at different age groups. And that's amazing and wonderful. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The problem, though, becomes is when we want to have a standardized form of how we're going to have education. Well, now Jay and I are going to have to, in some point, either agree or disagree. And that's going to take place out in politics. And so there's going to be winners and losers in that. And I think one of the things we have to be careful about is the more things that you put into state hand, that means you're going to be creating potentially moral losers who then miss out on the system because we've granted that to the monopoly power.
Yeah, and I guess that goes back to last week where I felt like if these mandates on what cannot be taught are going to be made, they should be made at the local level. So, because like I said, Florida is a very diverse state, and I can understand where community standards and viewpoints, say somewhere in the Panhandle, might be very different from those standards in, I don't know, in the Miami Beach area, right? And so
anything goes there, Mike.
Well, I mean, but my point is that's the fundamentally conservative argument, right?
No. And look, I want to respond to Trey in that. I mean, but wouldn't it be better in the better libertarian position to say, listen, the government really, the government being the schools, ought not to be weighing in on questions of people's sexuality and the morality thereof, right? I mean, I think that's
I guess what I would suggest.
We'd really like you to stay out of this area. I don't see that as the government flexing its muscles in terms of taking over things. I see it as the opposite. Look, there's concerns about parents who want to be able to teach their kids at the pace they want to teach their kids, and especially on these issues, which are sensitive. And there are concerns, and I think you're right that there are concerns out there that, it's sort of like you used to be like, you don't want the argument used to be that, well, schools ought to teach sex ed stuff. And again, this is a little different than sex ed. And Mike, you're right to point that out about there's differences. There's a law already, and this may well be sort of a solution in search of a problem. But I think there is a big concern. There was a study that I saw recently, or a poll saying it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like middle school kids that like 40% are identifying as some non-binary gender. And you can say, well, wow, that's great. Look how far we've come. But as my concern has been for a while, and look, I had kids who went through this, and we went through the thing of my kids literally said half the kids in my class, because we're a little more progressive than the norm, identify as some other gender. To me, I'm not entirely sure that that's a healthy trend. The fact that it has blown up this quickly in over just the past couple years, it indicates to me that it might be something else other than.
To that point, and you're right. The numbers are up.
There is an actual concerns there that this is an issue out there. Parents would like to be in control of that issue, rather than having teachers or the school system be in control of this issue.
You're right. I mean, the number, though, wasn't anywhere close to 40-something percent. It was like 20, low 20s, and that's an important distinction. But, I think you can argue that, well, this is happening because people are being indoctrinated or something like that. I find that to be kind of a ridiculous argument, but, it's, not ridiculous.
I think indoctrinated is a strong word. I don't buy that, but
a parallel that I've seen recently is like it's interesting to notice over time by birth cohort the percentage of people who are left-handed, who see themselves and identify as left-handed, right? And all of a sudden it went strikingly up, starting from the birth cohort like born in the 1960s and 1970s, and it's because schools stopped forcing lefties to write with their right hand, and then it kind of averaged out at around like 11-12%, which is where it's been for quite a while now. And so it seems to me that another perfectly reasonable argument is we see people not identifying as strictly, one gender or the other, or one sexual preference, because it's not a binary type of thing necessarily. And I think more and more as we kind of learn about these things, that that sexual preference is not an either or necessarily thing for a lot of people, and it can change over time, certainly. And I think by forcing people into these boxes and by saying that, well, these kind of conversations are taboo for young kids, we're sending a certain message there that this is in fact deviant and something that we shouldn't be talking about, and that's really my concern.
Well, me again, I want to come back to the fact, and I think Jay is rightful to point out. Okay, parents want to be and rightfully should be part of the conversation about what their children are doing. But again, that's the fundamental issue that we face when you have state education provided through the mechanism that we do. And that means that there will always be moral winners and moral losers in schools. And those moral winners and losers will depend on your particular location. So you're either going to slice it up by state, you're going to slice it up more locally, but you're going to have winners, you're going to have moral losers. And so we're going to have this kind of argument about, well, who ought to be winning, who could be winning. Because again, you have to pick a side. Because Jay was saying a second ago, well, maybe there's a way to kind of be neutral about it. But as an educator myself, I don't think that's possible. I mean, education itself is embedded with normative values. And so I'm sure there are individuals who wouldn't want to come to my university because we have embedded normative values that are not everyone's normative value. And that's fair and that's okay. That's part of the marketplace of ideas. But the difference is, of course, is I'm not coercing anybody to have to meet my particular standards.
So I think from this point, we can move into the next part of our discussion, which is the reaction of Disney, and as well as the reaction of Florida to the reaction of Disney. Now, last week, Jay made the case that Disney was, in his sort of baseball analogy, throwing at the hitter by not opposing the legislation as it went through the process by staying silent, but only coming out against it after the fact, which in effect sort of blindsided Florida Republicans. And it seems to me that it's hard to convincingly dispute the first part of that narrative. Disney was absolutely initially silent on that legislation, and it only came out against it after pretty significant pressure from employees who did a walkout and also as well as LGBTQ plus groups. I mean, Disney's CEO actually wrote an open letter admitting this. This is on March 11th. This was several days after the law was, after the measure was passed by Florida's legislature and then went to DeSantis for his signature. But what I think here is less clear is this idea that because Disney chose not to exercise its First Amendment rights until after the law had been sent to DeSantis, that it was somehow being underhanded and that the company doesn't have the right to change its position in response to whatever pressures might be brought to bear on it. So I guess, Jay, I wanted to start with that because I'm having trouble accepting this analogy of it somehow being against the unwritten rules to change your mind about something and that be rising to the level of inviting retaliation. So maybe you can kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yes. There are unwritten rules in the legislative game. And most lobbyists would tell you the most important thing they have is their word. Their word is their bond. And this sounds crazy, right? That these lobbyists are ethical and so forth, and is their honor among thieves and so forth. But it matters because it matters to politicians, lawmakers who can go to someone, either whether it's a company, whether it's an industry group, whatever, and say, "What's your position on this?" And they say, "We're okay with it," or "We're against it." And then the lawmaker will go and do what they do. Because look, isn't that the job of the lawmaker is to seek out where these people are, and especially if it's an important constituency like your state's largest employer, and a sort of cultural force on its own. That has been vocal on these type of issues before. If you could ask Gina Carano about that, it would make sense that, listen, you go and ask them, where are you on this? Are you okay with this? If you have
I get
no response or a then so.
But I'm saying you're restating your argument, and that's fine. But my point is, maybe I wasn't clear in my point. What I'm saying is that certainly Disney, I'm sure there were conversations, and Disney said, no, we're sitting this one out. And the Florida Republicans said, okay, good to know. We're plowing ahead then. But I guess what I'm saying is, isn't it wrong, or not wrong necessarily? Isn't it understandable that Disney would change its position in response to, well, its constituencies, just like how politicians change their positions in response to pressures from their constituencies. I mean, don't corporations have that same right? I mean, certainly Disney said, I'm sure they didn't say, well, for now and for all time in perpetuity, we will always stand with you on this. It's like, I'm sure it was more a case of, no, we're sitting this one out. But it's not like they can't change their. I guess that's the part of it that I'm.
Yeah, no, absolutely, they can change their mind. But if they do that, then they have to understand they are breaking the unwritten rules, and they should expect consequences for it.
Well,
in terms of how the unwritten rules work.
With the unwritten rule, I think you're wrong on the unwritten rule.
Look, we're going to hurt you, and second, we're not going to trust you guys again, or at least not for a while.
No, I think you're wrong. I think you're actually wrong on the unwritten rule part of it. You're misinterpreting it. Now, if Disney had disingenuously said at the time, well, no, we're sitting this one out, and then just waited and sandbagged Florida, saying, oh, we're just going to get them on the back end, that would be violating the unwritten rule. But this is more just like a pitch just slipping out of the pitcher's hand and hitting a guy or something like that. So it's not like they intended to sandbag them. The reality, the actual political reality shifted, and so they shifted. And so, but even if I grant
that's in the real world, that's the same thing. Intent doesn't matter.
Sure, intent matters.
It's sort of, you said you were with us, and then you came, well, I changed my mind.
Well, if intent doesn't matter, Jay, then it's like saying in baseball, there's no difference between intentionally throwing at a batter and having a pitch slip and having you hit a batter. And you certainly wouldn't.
Here's the difference, right? I guess, let me put it this way. The violation, the throwing at the pitcher, is when they change their mind after they've already said, because it's sort of a speak now or forever hold your peace, right?
Okay. Yeah. That's ridiculous. Okay.
Look, this is why I'm on the show, right? To try to give you a sense of how the sausage is actually made.
Okay, I'm going to push back on that. Before you go on, I'm just going to say I fundamentally disagree and object to this notion that my position comes from a place of naivete about how legislation works. And you've argued that before. Just poor Mike in his ivory tower, essentially. He doesn't get how the world works, and I totally get how this works. I'm just saying that it's wrong. I'm not arguing that this isn't how it's being done. I'm saying that I'm making an ethical argument. And I'll also, in a minute, I'll make a constitutional argument. So let's put that aside right now. This idea that I'm just this naive academic who doesn't understand that politics is hardball. That's just fundamentally wrong. So maybe you can stipulate to that I am not, suggesting that, oh my gosh, this is horrible that people are playing hardball.
No, I'm not suggesting that.
Okay,
what I'm saying is, listen, when a person, entity, company in this legislative setting goes back on its word, the motives don't so much matter, and it's sort of that's what's sort of unethical, right, to me, right, and it's sort of like saying, well, you guys were okay with this a week ago, and like, well, yeah, but that's before there was any pressure on us. You know what I mean? That's sort of like, well, why do we bother talking to you in the first place then? If it's a matter of, well, you're fine unless someone else objects. Secondly, I get into this, just the weirdness, right, of Floridians or Disney employees or whoever walking out on their company because their company doesn't take a strong enough position on certain legislation. And to me, that's mind-boggling. Why? There's plenty of legislative acts that happen at the state and federal level that I'm not crazy about, but it would never occur to me to tell my employer, you have to do something about this. It's sort of this is a consequence of sort of our bizarre woke world, that now all of a sudden we expect our employers to carry political messages for us. And I think the response that Disney should have had when its employees were upset would be to say, listen, we understand that some of our employees may be upset, and we fully support their right to speak out against this and contact their state legislators, or the governor, or whoever, right? And you just,
Can I interject for just?
Hey, I was going to ask you because Jay and I have kind of come back and forth. Go ahead, please.
No, it's all good. You guys are having a good conversation. I didn't want to, but one of the things that was said there was, well, I guess there's two things, but one was you were saying, well, why suddenly would employers want to kind of involve themselves in the process? But I mean, corporate lobbying is old. I mean, a matter of fact, how many decades now has it outweighed every other form of lobbying no matter how you measure it? I mean, I don't know if corporate lobbying is somehow some kind of new wokeism. It's just that corporations have decided to lobby for different things at different times.
No, I'm sorry, Trey. The new wokeism isn't the corporate lobbying. The corporate lobbyists said there's no problem with this. The wokeism came from the idea that we have to do something
put pressure on their company. Yeah. But I mean, okay, so if I recognize that I can get I already know I'm an employee for Disney. I know that Disney lobbies, and I know that they have a ton of power in my state. It would be really weird to think, oh, I'm not going to lobby. I mean, I'd have to be really dumb, in other words, to say, I could pull this particular level, i.e., get my particular corporation that has massive amounts of lobbying influence to take my position. Or me, Joe Smo, the person who nobody cares about, can go down to can go up to Tallahassee and tell them to do it. I guess I don't understand why that's wokeism. I mean, that just seems like a natural extension of the fact that individuals who are parts of corporations who do most of the lobbying can now have the ability to affect their company's lobbying.
Yep.
So I mean,
I'm going to agree with Jay on this. I'm going to agree with Jay almost nothing on this issue, but Jay, I will agree with you on this particular aspect. I think you're right. I think it seems to me absolutely the case that while Trey, you're right that certainly corporate lobbying dwarfs all other forms of lobbying, the sort of lobbying that we've been seeing on behalf of cultural issues that are really not related to the core business of the company, right? This don't say gay bill. I mean, it's not like it's tied in with anything directly to Disney and its interest in, increasing shareholder value, that sort of thing. So I think that absolutely is a new thing. And so, Jake, you're right on that, but I don't necessarily see it as being, necessarily wrong. Certainly, individuals have always been able to do this sort of thing. They haven't in the past for various reasons, and it is a new thing. And so, but to me, then the question is,
but empirically, Mike. I mean, empirically, isn't that going to be part of the reason? I mean, again, I am not an interest group specialist, although I attempt to keep up with this. But it seems to me that it's a natural hypothesis working its way through the science in the sense that once upon a time, the outlets for workers' lobbies would have been labor unions, and that simply isn't the case anymore. And so today, what you see effectively is worker groups lobbying their corporations to then lobby things. So I mean, I guess yes, new, but maybe not surprising.
Okay, yeah.
But Trey, my point is that what Disney did after the bill passed, the statements that's not lobbying. Lobbying is when the bill is proceeding through committee. You call up the drafters and you say, listen, some of our employees have concerns. Could we tweak the language to fix this and this? Or you say, listen, a lot of our employees have concerns. I want to let you know we can't be for this. We are against it.
I'll disagree with that.
Lobbying isn't just then lobbing the bomb afterwards and saying this is an affront to basic human rights.
No, that is a form of lobbying.
It can be sometimes.
Yeah, it's a form of grassroots. It's a form of grassroots lobbying. I mean, lobbying is certainly, Jay, you're right. That's one form of lobbying, that kind of behind the scenes in the corridors of power sort of thing. But there are lobbying is really any attempt to influence the position of policymakers. And so that might not be traditional old school kind of working it out behind the scenes lobbying, but absolutely is lobbying. Go ahead, Trey. Sorry.
Let's go back to an actual example. I was thinking of like Microsoft So if you go historically back and take a look at Microsoft was one of the few early tech companies that's lobbying dollars ranked somewhere around zero. And then we have a bunch of antitrust and legislation passed that harms Microsoft. And during the process of the making of those bills, Microsoft basically said, we're going to sit this one out. And then it came down in a way that was very negative, and this is more traditional in this sense, right? They're like, listen, you're gonna have to pull Internet Explorer and other things out of this. You're a monopoly. Then suddenly Microsoft goes, you know what? Actually, we have a position on this stuff, and today they are one of the biggest tech lobbyist groups in the United States, and therefore, and after the fact, made some radical changes to the way. As a matter of fact, if it was not for the Microsoft lobbying, you would not have been able to have the Amazon and Apples that we have today. Ironically, but so there would be there's like a real world example of where you have a company saying, whatever on this particular. That's the federal level, of course. Whatever, do with it what you will. And then afterwards goes, maybe not. Maybe we should lobby a little bit more about this.
Right. Well, I think what Trey's describing, and this is what a phrase that a lot of lobbyists I know use, and this was Microsoft's problem, because in drafting those bills, its competitors were all playing the games. Its competitors were making political contributions, significant political contributions, and Microsoft thought it didn't have to. And the lesson there is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah, right.
And that's the way. Yeah.
This is why I'm a libertarian. Continue.
Well, before we get to that continued part, I think let's Trey. That's one of the things that you mentioned, I think, in either the Slack or the Discord, and that's why I'm a libertarian. Could you kind of expand on that, because I think that's an important point here?
Yeah, I mean, I know that oftentimes we libertarians, we get branded as like the crazy anti-statists, but I think at a more fundamental level, it's this kind of thing where we have the most to offer, which is to say, look. Do we really want to live in a world where, and Jay, I think you're right. So don't get me wrong. This is not a critique, right? Where if you're not lobbying, then you are the menu, right? Yeah. Is that any kind of real market system that we want to live inside of? And so for me as a libertarian, and again, this kind of goes back to what we were having a conversation with when it came to the Don't Say Gay bill, right? There are so many different visions of what the good life looks like. And yet we want to, in all these different ways, constrain people's ability to do it because we don't particularly like it. And we want to make these rules. What does it matter? Right? So, okay, here in this particular instance, Disney gets all of these special statuses. Why? Because a bunch of state politicians thought it would help them out financially if they did this for Disney. And now, because they think it's going to lose them some wokeness points, they're going to go the other direction. Shocking. Absolutely shocking that when you let little petty tyrants have this ability, that they'll eat your lunch or eat you for lunch in this case. So Jay, I agree with you on that front, but it's an example of kind of the problems with having capitalism as opposed to true free market libertarianism.
Okay. Let's also talk about the First Amendment issue here, because I think that's another component of this we haven't really quite gotten to yet. It seems to me and to a lot of folks that this is an example of government using its power to chill speech that it doesn't agree with, more specifically, speech that criticizes government action. And, I think, Jay, you argued last week that it's one thing to deny somebody or some company a benefit that's kind of broadly available because of its speech, but it's something very different, revoking a special benefit only given to a specific entity because of its speech. Is that more or less a fair characterization of kind of your position?
And I also would draw a distinction between executive and regulatory actions versus legislative actions.
Okay, and being that legislative would have more legitimacy in some way.
Yeah, in that, legislative actions by their nature are corporate, right? You have all kinds of people voting for all different reasons. it is more difficult to assign a motive. Now, do I think the motive here was retaliatory and they're mad because Disney did this, poked him in the eye? Yes, absolutely. But of all those people who voted, there may have been some legislators who are like, I never liked this special district status stuff anyway. I think the corporations get too many tax breaks. This is corporate welfare. The Rise of Skywalker sucked. There could be all sorts of reasons where you could say I'm going to stick it to Disney. And the case law on this, in terms of 1983 violations, right, in terms of bringing a civil rights violation against some government actor, there is essentially a legislative immunity to that for that very reason. And the question the court looks at was, look, we don't care what the motive of the legislature was. What we care about is this an actual legitimate legislative decision. As opposed to like a bill of attainder, in which case the legislature is sort of acting as like judge and jury, and there's sort of that, which is a different thing. But so that's my sense of it, is that also the legislature has a duty to respond to its constituents, the actual people, and if those people are saying, hey, you know what? If Disney's going to take this attitude about an issue we care about, we, the people, are going to take the attitude that maybe they're not entitled to the special status that they've received all these years. And again, I would distinguish that from a situation where, we're going to single out a certain company for enhanced regulatory enforcement, that type thing, or even a certain industry.
I should point out that Disney's status is special in a sense, but there are something like 1,800 of these special tax districts in Florida, so it's not like it's a thing that was just done for Disney. Now, the scope of Disney was a lot bigger because, of course, Disney is the state's largest employer, and but it's not like this is this one-time thing that was done just for Disney that has never been done before. It's been done literally, over nearly 2,000 times before, and I think that's an important.
Not for a private corporation. I think that's there's all sorts of these special districts, right, where you create a special sewer district, you create a special whatever economic port authority district, and those there's enough problems with those to begin with, and that there's sort of a lack of accountability and transparency in how they operate. But they're still essentially public bodies. This, you're taking a public body that is essentially run by a company. It's like a huge company town, is what it is. And look, I could even make a decent argument that Disney is special because of this, because of how much land they own and all that they do. And I actually remember I took a trip there back in, this was probably 2010-ish or something. But it was when the 2005, I guess, was the first one, but it was the Iraq War fallout, and my thought was Disney should rebuild Iraq, because these guys make the trains run on time, and it is like their own government that they run, and they actually do it well. So I think you could make an argument that it's not unreasonable on the merits that they should be able to do this. But I think it's one of those, if you live by that carve out, then you die by that carve out too. And if you're going to get involved this deeply, and Trey's right to some point exactly, that the better libertarian position, and I'd say the conservative position, is that we don't get into making these special favors for anybody and have a freer market. What that does is, one, it's more freedom for competitors. Second, your company is not under the government's thumb, that you always have to rely on this special protection. And I think that's another bigger issue, that the more regulated a company comes, and it goes also to the bigger question we talk about a lot about money in politics. And I keep saying the way to get money out of politics is to get politics out of running businesses.
And, that definitely is, I would say, an important but sort of separate issue. But absolutely, right, from a libertarian perspective, you say, well, should there be special tax districts? Well, no, there shouldn't actually be these special corporate crony capitalism favors, right? Now, but as to the retaliation sort of thing, and Jay, I think, you're right in pointing out that, well, do we know that everyone in the legislature was doing this specifically to retaliate against Disney? No, but I think it's fair to say that when the governor at the signing ceremony basically says this is in retaliation, that there is a general,
Yeah, no, and I'm saying as a practical matter,
Yeah.
the way courts have looked at this is that you don't look to legislative intent because there could be hundreds of different legislative intents
Right.
with each.
Right. Now, the closest that the Supreme Court has actually come to addressing this question was back in 1996. There's a case called O'Hare Truck Service versus City of Northside. And this was an instance where there was a towing company that was removed from kind of the rotation of companies that the city used for towing in retaliation for a specific company publicly supporting the opponent of the city's mayor in a re-election campaign. And so in a 7-2 decision, Scalia and Thomas dissented, the court found that this constituted a violation of the company's freedom of speech. Now, right off, I should point out that this seems to fit much more into
Whose freedom of speech, Mike?
The company's freedom of speech. Now, that's a separate issue, certainly, but it has been established by the courts, right, that corporate entities have free speech rights. That's a separate issue, and we could talk about that. But given that is now accepted point of law, certainly by the Supreme Court, let's follow on from that. So now I should say that right now that seems to fit into that category of things that's, well, a benefit that's available to a bunch of companies, but one company was excluded in retaliation. So maybe that's not directly on point, and that's a fair point to make. But when I read the decision, I felt like there were principles that apply pretty clearly to the Disney case. For instance, Justice Kennedy, who wrote for the court, said that the city terminated a relationship that, based on longstanding practice, he, and that's the owner of the company, had reason to believe would continue. We see nothing to distinguish this from the coercion exercised in our other unconstitutional conditions cases. And why I think this applies is because certainly Disney had every reason to believe that this special status that had been in place for over half a century, they had every reason to believe that would continue. Now, the court went on to say, respondents' theory, in essence, is that no justification is needed for their actions, since government officials are entitled, in the exercise of their political authority, to sever relations with an outside contractor for any reason, including punishment for political opposition. Government officials may indeed terminate at-will relationships unmodified by any legal constraints without cause, but it does not follow that this decision can be exercised to impose conditions on expressing or not expressing specific political views. Now, that seems to me to be pretty directly on point here. And that's basically what I was arguing last week. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, to come in here a little bit is to say one potential problem with that, and I didn't take a look at that precedent, is right. In this case, you're talking about a city, and the individual and the governing body that made that decision was which one, Mike? I'm make sure I'm getting this right.
The governing body that made what decision? Sorry.
In other words, that took him out of the rotation.
Oh, that was the city. I guess that would be through an executive. I would guess it would be the
that's what I thought. Yeah. So I think it was through their cities have. I'm blanking on that term. City manager or whatever. I don't think that would apply to the same way when you're talking about a state legislature necessarily.
Well, I understand, and that's an important distinction to make, but it seems to me that the general principle, I mean, the court wrote that government officials may terminate at-will relationships, and certainly I would say that legislature is that government officials, that includes legislature.
Now, Jay, correct me if I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I thought you, but now, Jay, correct me if I'm wrong. I think in that terminology, when you talk about government officials, you're actually talking about kind of what we would think of at the national level as agency level officials,
right.
Not
executive
lawmaking officials. There's a distinction there legally.
See, I agree, certainly. with that technical distinction, but I think the general point that the court was making is that the state in general cannot just take action specifically to retaliate against somebody who speaks out against the state. That to me is the broader First Amendment freedom. If the First Amendment is to mean anything, it means that people, those who have First Amendment free speech rights, are free to speak out against the state without this threat of retaliation or coercion from the state. And that to me seems to be a bedrock principle that the state of Florida, that the Republican legislature and governor have basically thumbed their nose at and just said, hey, too bad, politics is hardball, and we're going to chill your free speech as much as we can. And to me, that's just repugnant to the First Amendment.
So I guess, I just want to touch real quick on what was mentioned in the case, the unconstitutional requirements doctrine. Because there's a great amicus brief that was filed with the Ohio Supreme Court not too long ago on that topic. Unconstitutional.
Who was the author?
Yeah.
The unconstitutional conditions doctrine is essentially it tends to arise in executive action, right? It is the case. So I'll give you a real example. Actually, it's the Sixth Circuit. I said Ohio Supreme Court, but so the city of Nashville says, okay, if you want to build something, you have to get a building permit. And all right, fair enough. And then the city of Nashville says, you know what, we've got this thing where we're trying to rebuild all the sidewalks in the city. So if you want to build something, you have to pay to build these other sidewalks in the city. And the owner says, well, wait a minute, why do I have to do that? Why is that a condition of my receiving the building permit? The building permit should be based on these objective criteria, right? Is it so far back from where it's supposed to be? Is it this much? Is it built with the right specifications and meets code and all that kind of stuff? Not that will you also fund this other project that we're involved in? And that's the kind of thing I think we're talking when you get into unconstitutional conditions. They tend to be not on legislative acts, but administrative permitting acts.
Well, let me ask you this then. So does that mean that the executive branch doesn't have the right to retaliate against companies for exercising First Amendment rights, but the legislature does? Is that the theory here?
In part, yeah.
See, I find that to be untenable.
Talk about retaliation. I think if you had a legislative action that strips someone of some other benefit to which anyone would otherwise be entitled to, right? That you're saying, listen, we're going to raise taxes on just this company.
Gotcha.
I think that's different, and I think then you get into like equal protection kind of claims, right? In addition to the First Amendment stuff.
So then, one of our executive producers, Ryan Beasley, he kind of tried to sum up a lot of what I was getting at. I guess he wrote, regardless of party affiliation, regardless of historical precedent, and given that we can prove the motive, which in this case is quite evident, should politicians be allowed to pass laws in retaliation of a private company that publicly disagrees with them and holds a legitimate stance on that controversial issue on behalf of their stakeholders? And your answer to that would be yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty clear. And my answer to that would be no. Okay.
What does Scalia and Thomas say in that dissent?
I don't have the dissent in front of me, but I would expect that it would be along those lines. So I would agree with I would certainly. So I guess,
and the idea is, look, I'm not saying it's something good or it's something that they ought to do, right? But I can think of plenty of so for example, California. I don't know whether they've done this legislatively or executively, but lots of cities of California have banned people from, their government employees from traveling to conferences in whatever states that they have. There are voting laws that they don't like. I mean, I guess do you see that's in a sense a type of retaliation. Now it's a type of retaliation against an outside entity, um, but you could have retaliation against other inside entities, and I think this happens all the time, is that the government does things to encourage or discourage certain behaviors. Um, and look, I'm not saying that there aren't. Does it trouble me that the idea of government
attempting to chill
firing back
speech
against
against the
private
government?
company
Yeah.
for some of this? No, of course it troubles me a little bit. But I think I'm still viewing this more through the lens of the unwritten rules of playing the game. And I
Gotcha.
so
Okay. So, we should point out that the law that revokes Disney's status won't actually take effect until June of next year. And there are a number of people who are saying that, you know what, this was just kind of the Florida's opening salvo, if you will, in this, the shot across the bow, and that in the end, they're not going to go ahead and impose what would be a pretty significant tax increase on the two residents of the two counties affected. And they're going to find some sort of a behind-the-scenes sort of solution that will allow DeSantis to say, look, I struck a blow against corporate wokeism, and allow, Disney to not end up losing its status, maybe being changed in some way. I was wondering, what do you guys think about that, Trey?
All of this disgusts me a little bit. So it's hard. It is hard, I think, in this instance to make a reasonable empirical prediction, because so much of it hinges on what actually happens with DeSantis's ability to run for president. And I'm not able to see into that crystal ball yet. I mean, anybody who says that they can is just
lying.
They're not making
Deluded,
empirical guess there. Yeah. And so, I mean, is that a plausible future scenario? Yes. What it hinges on, though, is DeSantis's realistic ability to run for presidency or not. And so because of that, I'm hesitant to make a prediction where I don't have enough evidence to say something.
I think that's absolutely what will happen.
Okay. And now I got to say, we should point out, right? Jay is generally not the person to take those very clear, make those kind of predictions. And so that is an impressive thing. And again, we will end this particular story with me agreeing entirely with Jay. So I will point out these moments of agreement. So yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right about that, Jay. I don't think that's it's not going to end up happening.
Which again, that's a little bit of why maybe I am less troubled by some of this other thing, because I view this, like I said, as through the prism of, here are the unwritten rules of the game, and that's what I see happening.
And I think, though, from a
Can I add just one thing?
Go ahead, Jay. Or Trey. Yeah.
So I think sometimes this is one of the things this really is one of the things that frustrates me, is this idea that, well, it will be okay. Like, we don't have to worry about the pragmatics of it because, something, it'll all work its way out. Right. Like, I don't know. The idea that this kind of the idea that there's these unwritten rules that we're going to do because we don't want to do it above board just bothers me. But I recognize that's a much broader conversation.
No, Trey, my to some extent, I look at this as it's almost more an inertia kind of thing, right? I think it would be extraordinarily difficult for Florida to actually pull this off. There would be all kinds of.
Oh no, I wasn't suggesting that you
I
were
think
advocating
that's
for
why
it.
DeSantis is saying, "Listen, I'm going to do this," and it's just a threat. But I don't think he'll really follow through. And I think Disney realizes that. But he sent the message.
Exactly, but see, I guess here's where I start. I hear you, and so please, I wasn't trying to put any words in your mouth, because you're right. On those fronts. What I'm suggesting, though, is that those kinds of patterns of behavior are dangerous, because it only takes one person, Trump, who doesn't care about norms, Trump, to then drastically destroy those kinds of systems. And so maybe I'm particularly on edge about those kinds of things, because anybody who wants to be like Trump, DeSantis, worries me on those kinds of fronts, which is maybe why I'm not quite as willing to make that prediction. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think we had a really great discussion on this, and I should be congratulated for inviting Trey to join us because I think you added a lot to this, Trey. So that's great. Yeah, no, and it's gone on for quite a while, and so in effect, this is the end of our end of our ad-supported edition. We're going to have a lot more to talk about, though, for our Politics Guys supporters on that part. We're going to talk about Elon Musk buying Twitter. Another thing I definitely wanted to get Trey's viewpoint on, eager to hear that. Russia and Ukraine, the Title 42 thing, maybe, depending on time permitting now, Supreme Court and religious expression. I think our uniquely stupid last decade might have to wait 1 more week or 2 more weeks. But anyway, if you're a Politics Guys supporter, all of that's coming right up in a second. If you're not, you can get full episodes by becoming a supporter. Go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys, as well as through PayPal. You can find support links in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. And if you just are not in a position to be able to financially support the show, but you'd like to hear about all of the stuff we talk about every week, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get you set up with all of that. Whether you're a supporter or not, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate the show, and leave reviews on whatever podcast app you use, and also share episodes on social media. Thanks so much.